Good afternoon to all our speakers and guests present here today and to those joining us online. On behalf of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance and the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance of the University of Canberra, I am pleased to welcome you to the panel discussion on deliberative democracy and climate change, exploring the potential of climate assemblies in the Global South. My name is Naila Prieto, and I am your MC this afternoon. Before we formally start, we would like to play this Welcome to Country video by Auntie Dr. Matilda House Williams.
Jan, hello. Today we meet on the land of the Ngunnawal people, which Canberra sits. Canberra means meeting place, and it has been a place of gathering for my people for over thousands of years. To me, a welcome to country is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owner's consent to an event taking place on the land. On behalf of the Ngunnawal people, I would like to invite International IDEA to meet here on the sacred land. I stand here today in this place where once my ancestors before me camped and told stories of many years ago. I'm a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors in spirit with me as I walk into the future teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, the Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people present today. I'd also like to acknowledge the other cultures that are in the room today. In keeping the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here. Yara, goodbye. On behalf of the Ngunnawal people, I would like to invite International IDEA to meet here on the sacred land. I stand here today in this place where once my ancestors before me camped and told stories of many years ago. I'm a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors with me as I walk into the future teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, the Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people present today. I'd also like to acknowledge the other cultures that are in the room today. And keeping the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here. Yara, goodbye.
Before we proceed with the program, I would just like to mention that we have a photographer roving around. So if you are uncomfortable with your photos being taken, kindly inform the photographer or one of our staff. To open our program, may I please call on Lina Ricky Latamang, Regional Director of the Asia and the Pacific Office of International IDEA. Lina.
Thanks, Naila. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all for the launch of our new report, Deliberative Democracy and Climate Change, exploring the potential of climate assemblies in the Global South. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. And I wish to acknowledge the Ngambri Ngunnawal peoples as traditional custodians of the land we are meeting and pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending either with us in this room or online. And I also extend my warm welcome to Excellencies, members of the diplomatic community, visiting dignitaries, scholars, students, and everyone present. Let me first very briefly introduce International IDEA, Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We are a global institute headquartered in Stockholm, Sweden, and our Asia and the Pacific regional office here in Canberra, in this very building, the second floor. Like the United Nations, we are comprised of diverse members, all continents represented, east, west, north, south, Australia as one of our founding members. And I wish to thank our member state representatives present here today. We appreciate your support very much. We work with multilateral and national actors, including parliaments and election management bodies, but also democracy defenders and civil society, in harnessing global action to support and advance, and increasingly to defend democracy. And I wish to recognize the presence of a high-level parliamentary delegation from Bhutan, who are visiting Australian Parliament this week and with whom we work closely. The Kingdom of Bhutan is renowned for its constitutional commitment to protect 60% of its forests, and if I'm not mistaken, being the world's first carbon negative country in the world, while suffering from the consequences of the melting Himalayas. We believe that the climate change is the defining challenge of our time, and that while science is clear and solutions we know, the barriers to addressing climate change are primarily political. Our increasingly polarized societies fail to build the necessary consensus, causing our policy responses to remain insufficient in both scale and speed. And if democratic institutions are unable to find effective solutions to the climate change and crisis, democracy itself will struggle to remain a credible and legitimate political system. And this is why International IDEA launched a new work stream in 2022, focused on intersections between democratic decision-making and the climate crisis. And among other aspects, like role of parliaments and constitutions and climate litigations, it includes looking at how democratic innovations may improve climate policy. And climate assemblies are an example of such an innovation, directly involving citizens in shaping climate policies and also in adapting to consequences of the climate crisis. And this report explores lessons from the first generation of climate assemblies and considers how deliberative practices might drive more ambitious citizen-led strategies, and also investigating how to build on the existing, ancient or emerging deliberative practices from Global South. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion to come, and I'd like to thank our report's co-author, Dr. Nicole Curato, and the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, and also Center's director, Professor John Dryzek, for co-organizing this event. And I also extend my thanks to the Agence Française du Développement, AFD, for funding this publication. And many thanks in advance to our fantastic panel of speakers, and my special thanks to Kerstin Pischop, Acting First Assistant Secretary from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, for stepping in and providing the concluding remarks. We are very excited to release this report and look forward to your feedback and ideas on how to implement the recommendations it presents. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. May I now invite distinguished Professor John Dryzek of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance.
Okay. Thank you. So on behalf of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, I'd like to join in welcoming everyone to this significant event, although I'm actually not the director at the moment. I have been in the past, but I'm not currently the director. The Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, I'll just say a very small number of words about it. So we are located at the University of Canberra. We're the world's biggest research centre in deliberative democracy, and we like to think that we're the best, although we should probably let others judge that. Before we moved to the University of Canberra 10 years ago, we were actually at Australian National University, and so we served our time in the Research School of Social Sciences, which of course occupies this building now. And we also have a long history of working on deliberative democracy and climate change. Now, those of us who work on democratic innovations, such as citizens' assemblies, do face a number of challenges in today's world. I mean, in some ways it's paradoxical that what is sometimes called the deliberative wave of innovation, citizens' assemblies, citizen juries and so forth, at the same time that that's been proliferating worldwide, we also seem to see a global retreat and backsliding when it comes to democracy. So that's something of a paradox to figure out, well, how do we counter that backsliding as deliberative democracy thinkers? So that's one big challenge. And we do have answers, but it would take me too long to say what they're all about. But what I want to do is also mention that in the context of climate change in particular, we see lots of deliberative innovation in climate change around the world. So there is something of a deliberative wave when it comes to climate governance as well. But at the same time, we don't see enough in the way of progress when it comes to climate governance in general. And if we look around the world at the global level, in many national levels, including Australia, of course, we see climate governance performance as not being remotely up to the task of preventing the headlong slide into catastrophic climate change for the world as a whole. So where does that leave us? I mean, we have this excellent report which shows how we can learn from experience, not just the experience of design deliberative events, but also the practice of deliberation in the global south. So it's important that we learn from that. But it's important also that we think about the place of climate assemblies in larger systems of governance and think about transforming and affecting those larger systems. I mean, they're not going to be the key to progress when it comes to global climate governance, but they're surely one important part of the governance puzzle. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. May I now call on Wendy Conway-Lab of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance to chair the panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Nyla. Good afternoon, everyone, Your Excellencies, colleagues, friends. I am honoured to be here on Ngunnawal country to chair this panel section of the event. Here's the plan. We'll hear first from Professor Nicole Karatu, who's the lead author of the report being launched today. If you didn't already grab a copy on your way in, please do on your way out. I'm assured there's plenty for everyone. The title of it is, as you would know, Deliberative Democracy and Climate Change, Exploring the Potential of Climate Assemblies in the Global South. So after inviting Professor Nicole Karatu to give us a presentation, we'll then hear from our three esteemed discussants. But I will not invite them up here because we all want to be able to see Nicole's slides. So without further ado, I will... and then also on housekeeping, I am conscious that there are people watching online as well. So just to let you know, feel free, please, if you have comments, questions, to pop them into the chat. And I'm assured that when we get to the Q&A section of the event, we will, as much as we can within the short time frame, try to hear from both online participants, audience members in the room here today. With that, I would like to invite to the podium Professor Nicole Karatu, who's the lead author of this report. Nicole Karatu is a professor of political sociology at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Her research focuses on the transformative power of deliberative governance in fragile and conflict-affected settings. She's advocated for and contributed to a global deliberative democracy model inspired by decolonial theory and practice, critical historiography and ambitious democratic experiments, such as the Global Assembly on the Climate and Ecological Crisis, which some of us here have done research on. Nicole is the founder of the Global Citizens Assembly Network, GLOCAN, you might hear it called today, also former editor of the Journal of Deliberative Democracy and founding editor of the Deliberative Democracy Digest. And she's published prolifically, including multiple books. So without further ado, enough from me, over to you, Nicole.
Thank you, Wendy, for that generous introduction, and good afternoon, Your Excellencies, dear friends and colleagues. And thank you to International IDEA and the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance for creating a space this afternoon for us to have a meaningful discussion on deliberative democracy and climate change. I'm especially grateful to my co-panelists who are generously sharing with us today. And my gratitude also goes to Naila Prieto, Mia Stewart, and Olive Mendoza, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this event happen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land where I work and live. I am a diasporic settler in Canberra, the land of the Ngunnawal people. And the work that we do in the center builds on over 65,000 years of Indigenous knowledge systems. And we are grateful to learn from the traditional custodians of this land as we advance our work on deliberation and the environment. Now, deliberative democracy and climate change are two topics that are very close to my heart. Just last week, my home country, the Philippines, was once again submerged by severe tropical storm Trami, locally known as Typhoon Christine. The storm left at least 85 dead and dozens missing. On broadsheets and social media, many Filipinos have rejected the patronizing rhetoric of resilience. We are tired of being praised for surviving difficult situations in the absence of long-term sustainable solutions. What we need, as this viral image suggests, is not resilience, but accountability. Those in power must be held responsible to prevent these tragedies from recurring. And I fully support this call. But beyond demanding accountability, I argue that climate-vulnerable countries like the Philippines need impactful public deliberation on the climate and disaster policies that shape our lives. See, the problems we face today are so complex that we cannot afford to leave climate policy making and implementation in the hands of experts, government agencies, and politicians alone. Instead, we need to amplify the voices of everyday people to realize the transformative power of deliberative democracy in fragile settings. And the challenge is to create mechanisms for these voices to be heard and taken seriously. What do I mean by this? I've been working on deliberative democracy for the past 15 years. In my work, I consider deliberative democracy as a political aspiration and as a political project. As a political aspiration, deliberative democracy envisions a society where collective decisions are made based on inclusive, informed, and reflective exchange of reasons. And of course, I'm the first to admit that our world today is so far from this ideal. For many countries, patronage, nepotism, corporate greed drive policymaking instead of evidence and the pursuit of the common good. Meanwhile, our information ecosystem is a minefield of distractions. Clickbait headlines hijack our attention, while quality information sits behind paywalls. So many of you may be asking, is deliberative democracy just a naive political fantasy? The answer is no. Deliberative democracy is not a naive political fantasy. This is why we need to appreciate it as a political project that offers a practical vision for building a better collective life based on inclusive, informed, and reflective exchange of reasons. As a professor at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, the part of my job that I cherish the most is meeting communities around the world that advance democratic practices, that celebrate rather than eradicate our differences, and in so doing, craft decisions that are sensitive to different perspectives and experiences. In my fieldwork in the Philippines, I've seen everyday people, fishermen, market vendors, housewives, shopkeepers. I've seen them collaborate with community organizers to rebuild after losing everything to the world's strongest storm. Together, they raised 1.1 million euros through philanthropic funding to secure 12 hectares of land, now home to over 500 housing units. I had the privilege of observing them deliberate on everything, from choosing building materials and renewable energy options to deciding the paint color of their homes. So obviously the answer is orange. They tackled difficult issues that even government agencies struggle with, such as establishing fair standards for selecting beneficiaries of the homes. Some argued that only those who participated in deliberations should receive the homes, while others believed that everyone in the community, especially the elderly or mothers unable to attend long meetings, should be included. And through their deliberations, they did more than build climate-resilient homes. They created a self-governing community in a climate-challenged world. And this initiative operated outside the state's official agenda of relocating coastal communities to the mountains. They asserted their right to the city, refusing to live in residential ghettos, quote unquote, that the government built on the outskirts of the city. There are many examples of deliberative democracy in action around the world. A Muslim youth leader from the Philippines once told me that his community has practiced deliberative democracy for a long time. Academics just gave it a name. And we don't need to introduce deliberative democracy to the global south. It has deep roots, for example, in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, where consensus-based decision-making, rather than majority rule, was used to maintain peace, form trade agreements, and manage shared resources in multicultural societies. In India, the 73rd Amendment institutionalized village assemblies, allowing every adult citizen to participate in deliberations on issues affecting their lives. And while these village assemblies, of course, face challenges, one unintended function they serve is exposing inconsistencies between government climate policies with local realities. So for example, and this is an example from the book Oral Democracy. For example, in one assembly, villagers questioned the state's priority of greening villages and banning tree cutting. Public land for building homes had become inaccessible due to tree preservation laws. So when the village secretary reminded the community to plant trees in front of their homes for the government's environmental campaign, a villager humorously responded, "There's no place to build a house. Where should we plant the trees?" Her fellow villagers laughed, illustrating how humor and dialogue can challenge and highlight gaps in government policy. But deliberative democracy isn't just about criticism. It helps build institutions. Porto Alegre in Brazil is the birthplace of participatory budgeting, which, in its overly simplified definition, empowers citizens to deliberate and decide on how part of the government's budget is spent. And to assess the climate impact of such a deliberative institution, it's important to take a long view. And Porto Alegre's experience is telling. Initially, citizens prioritized immediate needs like paving streets, improving housing, water, and sanitation. By 2002, these priorities led to near universal access to treated water, doubled the sewer network, and developed one of the world's best solid waste management systems, which emerged in collaboration with the citizens and the Scavengers Association. Porto Alegre also improved its environmental conditions, becoming one of Brazil's greenest cities, with 30% of its area dedicated to green space, and a third of that protected to sustain biodiversity. And this shows the power of long-term citizen deliberation embedded in government decision-making. And so in recent years, climate-sensitive participatory budgeting has gained traction as a tool to address climate impacts. None of the examples I told you are perfect, and that's the point. Just as we continue to invest in elections despite their imperfections, we must keep investing time and resources in deeply embedded practices of citizen deliberation in the global south. And the questions for us to consider include, how can we better support local governments to act as honest brokers of deliberation between citizens, policymakers, government agencies, and civil society groups? What skills do NGOs, activists, religious, village leaders, and yes, even TikTok influencers need to model deliberative behavior? And how can we maximize existing mechanisms for citizen participation to advance deliberation? There's so much work to be done in this area. In the past decade, there has been an interesting plot twist in the story of deliberative democracy, and that is the increasing popularity of citizens' assemblies. They are described as the flavor of the month in citizen engagement, as one colleague put it. A deliberative wave is taking place around the world, according to the OECD. So what are citizens' assemblies, and how are they different from the examples I mentioned earlier? Two design features set them apart. First, participants are randomly selected everyday people reflecting the diversity of society. A citizens' assembly typically includes equal number of men and women from various age groups, regions, languages, education levels, and attitude or views towards the topic of deliberation, such as climate change. Why is that important? Because, at least for advocates of citizen assemblies, the problem with public consultations is that they always attract the same groups. And so random selection, at least in theory, corrects this by inviting people who don't typically participate in politics. Second, citizens' assemblies are designed to filter or distill a range of views and evidence before making collective recommendations. So unlike surveys or focus groups, citizens' assemblies have access to experts who can support their deliberations and facilitators who enforce norms of open-minded deliberations in group discussions. And typically, the outcome of a climate or citizens' assembly is a collective statement or a set of recommendations handed over to the authority that commissioned the process, with the next steps depending on the context. So, you may be asking, are citizens' assemblies a game changer in climate policy? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that, but let me share with you the theory of change of citizens' assemblies as far as I understand the literature. And this is the theory of change. By bringing together a diverse group of everyday, ordinary people, we hear the judgment of citizens not captured by corporate interests or politicians whose decisions are constrained by short-term electoral cycles. And empirical data shows that not only are everyday citizens competent deliberators, the judgment of everyday citizens about what to do with a climate crisis is usually ahead of politicians. What this means is that citizens' assemblies give a boost to politicians or policymakers who want to take more decisive steps to address the climate crisis. And they can cite the Citizens' Assembly as an impartial body of everyday people who want to take far more ambitious measures than what is currently on the table. So let me just give you one example. The paradigmatic example of a citizens' assembly is the French Convention on the Climate, which President Macron convened in response to the Yellow Vest protests in 2019. So over 6 months, 150 randomly selected citizens listened to experts, deliberated in small groups, and proposed recommendations on how to reduce France's carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. The assembly gained a lot of traction because its recommendations informed climate policy in France, such as banning short-haul flights. A study by the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies found that 20% of the Assembly's recommendations were fully implemented and 51% were modified. However, the Assembly was also controversial. President Macron vetoed some of the most radical proposals, including a proposal to make ecocide, or the intentional destruction of ecosystems, a crime, stating that, and I quote, what 150 citizens have written is not the Bible. Therefore, he shouldn't necessarily follow it. In 2021, I, along with my colleagues at the Global Citizens Assembly Network, witnessed 100 randomly selected individuals, a waitress from Brazil, a student from China, a former humanitarian worker from Syria, deliberate for 68 hours to craft the People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth, presented at COP26 in Glasgow. And the Global Assembly on the Climate and Ecological Emergency shows the power of putting everyday people in charge of climate policy. One key lesson: ordinary citizens are willing to push for more radical climate policies than most state actors. For instance, like the case of France, the Assembly proposed making ecocide a crime as well. Now, there are an increasing number of climate assemblies taking place in the Global South. Later, I will invite my colleague, Friedel Markart, to describe the character of these climate assemblies, who funds them, who runs them, what are their impacts, Friedel did the research, ask her all the questions. But there are examples that we can look at. Resurgentes, for example, is the first region-wide climate assembly in Latin America, which includes Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. My colleagues from Colombia, Felipe Rey and Indira Latorre, wrote about this in the report. Meanwhile, my colleague Musra Al-Masri wrote a case study on an activist-led citizens' assembly on electricity and energy justice in Lebanon. And the main lesson here is that the impact of a citizens' assembly goes beyond influencing state institutions, especially when authoritarian governments refuse to listen. So the Citizens' Assembly in Lebanon actually sparked new political ideas, highlighting the community's role in reaching a plausible energy mix rather than a tech and corporate-driven solution to the energy crisis. So, in conclusion, what is the potential of climate assemblies in the Global South? I want to conclude with two reflections. First, we must ask, who is pushing for citizens' assemblies in the Global South? Activists from the region are clear about their demands: repayment of the global North's climate debt, ending corporate influence in climate talks, and radical cuts on emissions. Would our resources be better spent amplifying the voices of deliberative Democrats in the Global South, supporting how they want to structure global deliberations, and ensuring their demands gain more traction in global governance? Can citizens' assemblies enhance a more just North-South dialogue on climate justice? Second, citizens' assemblies, I argue, are only valuable if they adopt a global ethos. While flourishing in Europe, I think their impact is questionable if their recommendations to, for example, promote green energy, if that recommendation still exploits labor and resources from the Global South, such as cobalt mining in Congo for electric vehicles. So I think these innovations must reflect our shared interconnected politics, driving inclusive and just change. Because without these global ethos, I think we just risk replicating the same power structures that have caused today's unequal climate-challenged world. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Are people online hearing me now? Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nicole. That was wonderful. What a lot of provocations. And I think some of the take-home messages are climate change is something that affects everyone around the world, and this is not something that needs to be only decided in the global north, and that deliberative democracy is by no means something that has sprung up in the global north. It's happening all over the place, and how can we do it better? What's the role of climate assemblies in that? So may I invite you to sit here? May I kindly invite our three esteemed discussants to take the floor on these wonderful thrones. And just a reminder, welcome to everyone online as well. I did say, if you're in the room, to grab one of these reports, but if you're online, you can find this. It's free open access on the internet. This, in the spirit of deliberative democracy, we would not dream of just presenting this report without subjecting it to scrutiny and discussion from our esteemed visitors and, of course, everyone in this room who we know there's plenty of expertise and experience with aspects of deliberative democracy and climate governance in the room and online. But let me start this discussion by inviting each of our discussants their initial reflections on the report and on Nicole's presentation. So I will start, and we'll be handing the microphone around. I'll start with Sanskriti Menon. Dr. Sanskriti Menon is a senior program director at the Centre for Environment Education in India, where she leads a team focused on public deliberation. She has over 3 decades of experience in education for sustainable development, and her team's designed and implemented public participation processes for bicycle master plans, street design, Green India Mission, and you've played a very important role in the Global Assembly 2021 as the cluster facilitators. So over to you. I'll give each presenter about 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Thank you, Wendy. Sorry. Honored guests and hosts and friends online, namaste, good evening from Canberra. Personally, it's good to be in Australia. Sorry about that. It's good to be in Australia talking about deliberative democracy, because it is here that my engagement with the sector began, though across on the West Coast at Curtin University, Perth, with Professor Jeanette Hartskarp and Peter Newman. I want to commend the authors, Nicole, your co-authors Graham Smith and Rebecca, and International IDEA and the AFD for this timely report on climate change and deliberative democracy. I grabbed a copy as well, though I've of course read it online. And I agree with much of what you say in the report. I think it's a very important report, bringing together a lot of the thinking and research and practice, and focusing attention on the South. Because for us, the challenge is really large. We face rising threats. We are facing the impacts of climate. And also when we are talking about nature-based solutions, but as India, you know, India is seen as performing quite well in its meeting the national determined contributions. But the ambition is that we should be better in meeting our mitigation targets. But we have a very big adaptation challenge. And we also see rising threats to biodiversity. And you know, just a couple of days ago, the biodiversity report was also released, which was the Global Nature Conservation Index. And India faces you know, a lot of land use change. And this talk about nature-based solutions and adaptation becomes all the more difficult because of large-scale changes that are taking place. And I have no doubt that citizens' climate assemblies should be part of the solutions, should be part of how we focus on creating inclusive solutions that are well thought through, that increase our learning, and because they have an action orientation to actually spur action by communities themselves, things that we can ourselves do, and bring and put on the table for governments, local governments, or high levels of government and other bodies, make them listen and pay attention to things that people would like to see happening more ambitiously. The question is, how can they be of the quality that we need and also at the scale that we need? We are talking more than 250,000 village assemblies in India, more than 4,000 towns and cities. And how can they be relevant and meaningful for different contexts? You know, at CEE, where I work, we speak about the sari example. What is the sari example? I'm wearing a sari. This is not a stitched garment. It provides beautiful, there are many beautiful designs, and it depends on the wearer, whether she wants to wear it the way I've worn it, or, you know, with the palla coming like this. And there are many different designs in different parts of the country. The point is that how can we have a flexible tool which comes alive in the hands of the user and serves the purpose very beautifully. So can climate assemblies be like the sari that can be adapted to the local context as per the needs of the people there? And so I'd like to see sari-based climate assemblies as well. I want to highlight a few aspects, both strengths and challenges in the Indian context, which may also resonate with other societies in the global south. First, such as our own work with the State Action Plan on Climate Change in one of the states in India, and other studies such as the Yale study on climate change in the Indian mind show that while there is a lot of experience of the impacts of climate change, the knowledge about global warming is low. And I feel that climate assemblies have this very important role of also improving public understanding about climate change, the impacts, and what can be done, how can we be more prepared, how can we ask for more accountability. And it is an opportunity for communication design to develop really strong, effective learning materials and approaches for non-literate and semi-literate audiences, maybe visual materials. And it is a good challenge to have because we want to certainly increase knowledge and understanding about why climate change is happening, what can we do about it, etc. And I would say that we should look for partnership between the climate science community and educators and communicators and the organizers of climate assemblies to see how we use climate assemblies much more effectively to enhance learning and understanding about climate change. And this is especially important because a climate assembly is not a one-time exercise. We want the deliberants, the mini public and the public there to plug into knowledge systems going on, and how do we create both the knowledge systems that are responsive to the public's need for information, as well as build the ability of the community to plug into these systems and contribute to these systems. Because in India, for example, weather stations are very sparse. But if communities are doing their citizen science, can they plug in to enhancing the knowledge about what's happening on the ground? Second, though India is urbanizing, with about 35% of the population now in cities, and this trend is likely to continue, there is still a large traditional society with a culture of a frugal lifestyle. And this lifestyle is not only because of poverty, but because that is an ethic of living. And for example, eating local foods or reusing and recycling, having book banks and things like that, these are part of also our government's mission life, which is lifestyles for the environment. How can climate assemblies recognize the wealth of knowledge that communities themselves have, and enhance their pride and confidence as the role that they themselves already actually play in dealing with the solution and having been part of the solution? However, these traditional lifestyles that I mentioned, these are fast changing. And there's a great aspiration for a better life, and rightly so. But the images of the models of development that we do have, those continue to be of very high consumption. And somehow we see images on advertising, on our media, which are really, they're high-powered cars and there are clothes and there's very flashy images which are very seductive. More than 40 years ago, when the Rio Summit was happening, CEE was part of the submission to the Rio Summit, creating that report. And at that time, the discussion was that the challenge for development is how not to get to that type of development. And that still seems to be the case. So the question is that how do we improve well-being without increasing the carbon footprint too much? And this must be part of the content of deliberation as well. It is a question that all of us have to deal with, even if we are living frugal lifestyles today, because the trends of aspiration are such that promote higher consumption. Now, we do want more well-being, but not in the conventional forms of development, and that is a question that is up for deliberation. It should be part of the deliberation. And fourthly, there are many structural divisions in Indian society: caste, community, gender, etc. And how do we learn from the sortition-based approaches, both from deliberation practices within the Global South as well as new ones that are coming up? How do we integrate these and build into new deliberation practices that are relevant for us? And I think the research that political scientists and social scientists do about society, how does that inform climate deliberation practice? I think that linkage should be stronger. And finally, I want to say that, as Professor Dreisig also said, climate assemblies are part of a larger ecosystem of governance. And how do we make the linkage more effective? That is something which we all need to work hard at so that they become more effective. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Sanskriti. I think it's a real privilege to have your expertise and experience in the room today with really grounding how to make climate assemblies work in the context that you're working in India. And of course, there are decades of experience with deliberative democratic practices in your country. So thank you for grounding our discussion in that reality. I hope we'll have time to come back to that. But I'm going to go to Dylan now, Dylan Carver. Dylan Carver is an environmental advocate and political activist from Fiji and Tonga, and strategic engagement and communications lead at the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, PICAN, I think we say, and he coordinates Pacific youth activists and campaigns for climate justice and youth representation. I think it's fair to say, Dylan, that you're a proud Pacific climate warrior and a secretariat member of the Alliance for Future Generations, which is Fiji's largest youth network working on sustainable development. So it's so honoured to have you here today all the way from Fiji. Over to you.
Thank you. Pulvinaka, everybody. It's so great to be here amongst such esteemed panelists as well. I think, it's a bit intimidating as a young person coming and being set next to people that are professors and doctors and others. Yes. But yes, I apologize in advance because, as was mentioned, I'm an activist at heart, so I might come across as pretty frank in some of my points. But I think, I guess the initial point that I wanted to make was, upon reading the title, Potential of Citizen Assemblies in the Global South, my initial reaction was, oh, another thing the South has to do. And, we're already burdened by climate impacts. Then we have to deal with finding solutions and then also finding a process to come up with the solutions. And so while my initial reaction was like, oh, goodness, this is something that the Global South needs to do, it made me reflect on why citizen assemblies flourish in the Global North. And as an experience, I guess context here is I'm approaching this from a Global South Pacific perspective, noting that there are nuances between in the Global South itself. So you have Global South countries that have fossil fuels, and you have Global South countries that don't have fossil fuels. And so, give and take kind of situation. And so the comments that I make are coming from a Pacific Island experience, working on the ground, and just the experience of, working so hard. So the experience of the Pacific is different in that we actually do have leaders and political leaders that throw their weight behind ambitious climate policy. And so we have that connection with our government in that we are somewhat mostly aligned on climate priorities. And that's the reality of the Global South Pacific region. I can't say that that's the same for the Global South that have fossil fuel kind of considerations to make as well. And I think the point that I'm trying to make actually is, we have these connections with our governments, and there's already work that's happening on the ground. I believe Professor Nicole mentioned, the academics just gave it a name, but deliberative democratic practices are already happening in our region, and indeed across the world, across the global south. And so I think for us, if we're looking at truly implementing some of the recommendations in the report, it would be looking at the systems that already exist. So for example, in Fiji and the work of PCAN that we do, so for those that don't know, PCAN is a regional organization that works across the Pacific Islands region. So there's 190 member organizations, and we have presence in 4 countries, in Vanuatu, Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Solomon Islands, so very frontline communities. And the way that PCAN works is in somewhat a reflection of deliberative democracy, where we convene spaces to bring people's perspectives who are on the front lines of the climate crisis into the policy space. And again, it's not only about inviting people into the space, it's about making sure that the space is welcoming, is appropriate for those that are participating. And so for us, we adopt a Talanoa strategy, where people come in with stories. They don't come in with the policy jargon. They come in with stories, because our experience is that people on the front lines of the climate crisis, they know what's happening. They just don't use the same language that most people want to hear from the global south. And so we bring people into these spaces, we convene these spaces, and we place policy people in those rooms to listen, digest, absorb, and then it's from that point that we create our policy positions. And so, it's about incorporating all of these kind of different knowledge systems into the work that we do. And the reason that I brought that up is the global north, the global north countries, the reason that it flourishes there is because they're the ones that actually need to create that social mandate, to create that social ambition so that governments can act. In the global south, for the Pacific experience, it's very different. Our leaders are on the cusp of climate action. So if we're talking about solutions that have come from the Pacific, we're talking about the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Human Rights and Climate Change. That came from a law classroom in Vanuatu that made it all the way to the UNGA, the first advisory opinion to be adopted by the UNGA by consensus. And so if we're talking about solutions from the front lines, we're talking about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty that was first championed by Pacific leaders because Pacific activists got behind it. It's recognizing and naming that fossil fuels is kind of what we need to address if we are to fully address the climate crisis. And lastly, to conclude, I think this report is super important in the fact that if you follow international climate negotiations, next year, states are submitting their new revised national determined contributions. And I think this is probably the most opportune time to be talking about how we democratize the space in which these NDCs come about. And I think, for activists, for civil society, for academics, it's an important thing to start thinking about because it's an important aspect that you can hold your leaders accountable. And I think the last thing that I'm going to say is, whenever a Pacific or frontline community person, activist comes up and talks about all of these experiences, a question that's always asked is, how can we help? What can we do? And I think my response is always, and has always been, you need to do work in your country. The best way to help us is to move your government's position on climate policy. And if climate assemblies is the way that the global north is trying to do that, by all means. If it's coming to the global south, it needs to be contextualized. It needs to build on existing systems. So in Fiji, we have our provincial councils. We have, it needs to incorporate more than just, I guess, the conventional sense of stakeholders. It needs to include religious organizations. It needs to include youth activists. It needs to include civil society. And yeah, I think I'm just going to leave it there, and then I'll be happy to answer some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, thank you for bringing up questions of climate justice and reminding us that, this is not just about talking some nice talk and figuring out how to do deliberative democracy better and more inclusively, but the points that you're making sometimes get hidden in jargon like common but differentiated responsibility. What you're reminding us of is not only that communities, countries, governments in the Pacific are at the front lines of the adverse effects of climate change, but that you don't hold the responsibility for creating global warming. So that's something that I think is really worth putting on the table and not having it as the elephant in the room. And your point about so much that we can learn from our Pacific colleagues about Talanoa approaches and so forth. While we, acknowledge that it's really important that doesn't flip us into a perspective of like, oh, well, you can solve it then, and thinking about the burden that discussing deliberative democracy might bring. So thank you so much, Dylan. I'm going to turn now to Emily Beausoleil. Emily Beausoleil is a senior lecturer of politics at Te Herengawaka, Victoria University of Wellington, all the way from Aotearoa, New Zealand. She's also editor-in-chief of Democratic Theory Journal and the 2024 recipient of the American Political Science Association Distinguished Award for Civic and Community Engagement, because as I hope we'll hear more, she's very much not just a political theorist, but exploring the challenges and possibilities for voice and listening in conditions of deep difference, but also very experienced in community collaborations as a practitioner. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you for this report. Thank you for this, everyone who's been involved in organizing this, but also just the provocations already. And I know you have, there's so much more to discussing on this theme, so I just hope this is a bit useful. I'm abashed being here with you both, just feeling like, especially with this work, who we're most accountable to is where is it showing up of import and value in practical terms, and it's nothing if it doesn't do that. So I just feel, I was feeling that same feeling, but I was looking at my notes, I was like, oh, you're starting with a jargon word, Emily. Oh no. So anyway, this is my jargon word. The other day I stumbled on the phrase from De Sousa Santos of epistemicide, and that word is given to the ongoing destruction by the global north of indigenous peoples' knowledge, culture, memories, ancestral links, and relationships to the natural world. And I know that there's so much work to be done to redress this, but I was thinking this move even to care for, to attend to, and also to recognize the already extant practices of deliberation in the global south, and also look to how can these be strengthened, how to wrap around that is just a really lovely step towards in that ongoing work of addressing that epistemicide. So thank you for this. I speak from a really particular ground, really limited ground, which is I'm a European descent settler. I'm Western trained as a scholar. I'm living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, so I'm really located there where there's ongoing colonization and yet ongoing unceded sovereignty and ongoing governing authorities and systems of tangata whenua there. So in that context too, more specifically, I'm speaking from the little bit of place in terms of watching Citizens' Climate Assembly being designed by iwi, by the local authorities there, being led by Māori and also alongside those who've been climate activists for some time. So that's the little ground that I'm speaking from now. I was reading this report and thinking about how often when there's this Western conversation about the global north and deliberation, the limits or challenges are often pitched in terms of when it comes up against illiberal or undemocratic challenges, like co-optation and elite control and inequalities that really curtail the quality and the impacts of deliberation. And I just want to use this little bit of time today to offer that the challenges also stem from how deep difference can go and in our ontologies and our epistemologies. So like the ways we even understand ourselves to be and what the world is and how we come to know that world. Robinson studying Talanoa in the Pacific and also Maori hui, word for gathering or meeting, make the point that collective groups in the Pacific, collective groups create and shape individuals within the Pacific. A person is identified by their relations, social status, and position. Relational all the way through, never just individuals. And that has major impacts on design. Of course, it calls, as is integral in Talanoa and Hui, for far more profound relationship building, but it's also when those relationships of kinship and obligation are with the more than human world, with ancestors who are present with the spiritual world. What does that mean for these challenges of how these voices can be meaningfully heard and a part of process? Now, in Maori protocols, much needs to happen before deep dialogue can occur, with the sequence, really precise sequence that allows for that deep listening-based dialogue, aligning with particular places in the very meeting ground. So outside the wharenui, the house, is the realm of Tu, or Tu is the god of war, but also ego, or outward expression, action, separation. And in that space, on the physical place outside, all parties must first show themselves ready to meet, be welcomed in their differences, oriented to place, acknowledge ancestors and spirits present, candidly name even difficult and fiery dimensions that lie behind that meeting, hold those speaking on their behalf about that to account, and then break that division between parties through sharing breath and sharing food. Then, leaving one's shoes at the door, which is symbolic of leaving that ego at the door that's out there in the realm of Tu, stepping into the house, and in that house, that's the house of Rongo, or the god of peace, of deep listening, where a whole other set of further stages have to happen before deep dialogue even occurs, including drawing connections between participants, and whare korero, or literally how the house speaks, drawing on in that house the histories, relatives, stories that are woven into the very place, into the walls of that house, and speaking to how those speak with, actually do speak to, not just orient, but speak to that present context. Dale Turner has written recently on how listening to Indigenous peoples on their own terms demands more meaningful engagement with spirituality. And I think we can say the same for closer engagement with place and land outside of Western ways of thinking about that as static and separate and insentient, and also closer engagement with history and ancestors outside of Western notions that time is linear. And so this goes beyond design, right? This is about grappling, especially with climate change. How do we develop a shared understanding regarding our natural world and our place in it, often in highly constrained processes, time-constrained and otherwise, particularly when the Pacific is feeling the devastating effects of climate change that are already here in the Pacific and disproportionately lived. There's a particular obligation to center these ontologies, these ways of being and seeing. And that necessarily means a far deeper engagement, a learning and unlearning that often surrounds the deliberative wave. The challenges this raises for climate assemblies is perhaps most clear in the pushback that I've witnessed in this Maori-led climate assembly design around sortition, which is said to be one of its two key features. So this report dedicates a really valuable section on contending with what seems like common resistance to sortition, and gives a lot of great strategies for how to alleviate concerns. But pushback that I've witnessed in this context is actually not to do with traditional authority. It's not to do with a lack of trust or familiarity, yeah, that's there, but it's more to do with a fundamental clash between the deliberative demand for randomness and the Indigenous demand for relationality. So repeatedly in these conversations, what's interesting too is Maori and Pacific leaders in these conversations, in the co-design team, repeatedly are showing that they're not feeling heard, even where there's a strong representation in that group, and it's happening in the governing authority, right? Even then, that broader context of settler paradigms that are still standing in for the mainstream, and the kind of weight of climate assembly as a model are still, I'm watching, it places these Indigenous co-design members on the back foot in making their arguments, even on their own land. So this group is exploring an innovation that's kind of a compromise, where they're going to start with this traditional sortition and then maybe turn to community members to fill the gaps, where they're struggling. But even then, given how easy it is to slide back into Western ways of working and how codes of disagreement in the Pacific often entail silence that can be read as assent, it's really unclear whether this has actually been amenable to Indigenous communities or actually has harmed relationships further. And so you said in an interview with Mission Publique in 2022, which I love, you have so many beautiful things to quote, but I wanted to quote you back at you. Deliberation may have a different look and feel in various places, and our task as scholars and advocates of deliberative democracy is to celebrate the plurality of expressions of deliberation instead of imposing a single gold standard on what good deliberation means. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how flexible the Climate Assembly might be in response to these challenges across deep difference with Indigenous communities. Is sortition, for example, only one way to fulfill a more fundamental principle of representativeness? And you use the word like mirror. We could create other ways to create the mirror, the microcosm, or is it actually a make or break feature? And I'd also really love to hear your thoughts too, though, and this is where the evaluation and the researcher eye it needs to also be problematized, because to meet across difference means to take seriously that our terms of reference are going to be inadequate and need reworking. And so what does this mean for evaluation? What does this mean for funding? How should they be reworked to properly wrap around and support and then have meaningful engagement and hold accountable? Do good research, do good evaluation, but to take it in its own terms, different ways of working in its own time that will result in fundamentally really different practices. Already is. Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Emily. Of the many things that you touched on there, what I really like is that you've got us into some of the nitty-gritty of how do climate assemblies work, how should we do them, what do we know? The question of sortition, that's how do you identify the participants who will come and have the deliberations? Is it completely random, or is it weighted in favour of certain demographics? And then the question of how do we evaluate if we've done a good assembly? Those are things we're still learning. We're still doing research and trying to understand those and learning from practice. So fantastic. I'm sure I speak for everyone in reflecting that there are so many conversations and questions that we might have to all of you. Please start thinking about what your questions might be. We'll only have time to gather a couple, I think. But before we do that, while online and in the room you're thinking about your questions, may I please invite, as Nicole mentioned, Friedel Markart is one of the brains behind this report, which involved multiple researchers. She is from the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance as well, and did an inventory of climate assemblies in the Global South. So please let us know, what did you learn?
Do I need to? There we go. And everyone on the panel for some very thought-provoking presentations so far. But yeah, in our inventory of climate assemblies of the Global South for the report, we found a few interesting characteristics from this study. So typically they are initiated and commissioned by universities, who often partnered with international development and aid agencies. And in more recent experiments in Latin America, citizens' assemblies were initiated by members of democracy research and development. In terms of funding, that tends to come from international development agencies, universities, research centres, and NGOs. Most citizens' assemblies in the Global South were run by universities and civil society groups, and this is different to OECD countries, where there tend to be more specialist consulting companies implementing these processes. Size-wise, participant numbers ranged from 15 to 480. This is a wide range, but it is similar to the size of citizens' assemblies in the Global North. And also similar is the duration of the process. So generally, citizens' assemblies in the Global South lasted 2 to 6 days, and in the Global North, we find that citizens' juries run around 4 days, while citizens' assemblies in the Global North can go for around 18 days. And from our analysis, the citizens' assemblies took place in person, but one from the inventory had an online meeting as well. These specific citizens' assemblies covered a range of climate-related issues, so including water governance, energy justice, and pollution. And the outputs generated usually involved policy recommendations or a citizen's statement to local government officials. Forums that used a deliberative poll format generated a report demonstrating the shift of participants' preferences towards policy options. And in terms of impact, most of the reports define impact based on capacity building for assembly members. So while there currently isn't enough information on the policy impacts of these citizens' assemblies, we did find that most participants experienced an enhanced sense of political efficacy or empowerment from taking part. And participants also seemed to have increased expectations of government to take their policy input seriously after participating in these citizens' assemblies.
So as you can see, this is not a pie-in-the-sky theoretical idea. These climate assemblies are happening, although it's early days and there's so much more to learn and get better at. With that, I would like to open the floor up to see if we have any questions here in the room for our speaker, Nicole Kuratu, or any of our three discussants. And also anyone online as well. I assume I'll get a wave about questions from online. So yeah, I will. I'll give you this microphone, and I might invite you to introduce yourself and your question.
Hi, thanks for this wonderful session. I'm John Viana from RegNet here at the ANU. So I'm just wondering, for all the panelists, based on what you've raised, so with climate crisis manifesting in different ways, which is a very good problem. We've seen transnational fire and smoke to extreme flooding in particular localities. How do we balance between geographic scale with contextuality, especially when thinking of the practicability of particular proposals or solutions? How do we find that fine line, and how do we, especially when dealing with different forms of climate change problems? Thank you.
Thanks for a great question. Before I turn it over to the panelists, do we have any more? And we might collect a couple. Okay, another question here.
Hi, I'm Jed Delegado from the Crawford School of Public Policy. So my question probably to Nicole or to even the other discussants would be, how do we probably push UN global governance processes to maybe include deliberative way of people's assembly, right? Probably to complement or even replace the current multilateral environmental agreements processes like UNFCCC, the recent biodiversity COP in Colombia, and also the upcoming plastics treaty negotiations in Busan next month. So because we've been seeing in action or probably slow process and not ambitious goals, right, being pushed in this out of these processes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Would we have one more question before I turn it over? Yes, please. I'll let you grab the microphone because that means that everyone online can hear the question as well.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm Hemant. I worked at ANU a few years ago, and I have some public service experience as well. And thanks, Nicole. It was lovely talk and also demonstration of how you're mitigating climate change and so on. I have a question, I've read the book as well, which is really cool and so on. Are there any measures or the key performance indicators which have been looked into? And is there a method which is already existing to do so? So these are two questions.
Sorry, performance indicators for what?
Yeah, for the current policy, the consultations which you're having for the climate assemblies. So if you get some recommendations from those, these are going to the probably local council or the local governance. From there, how are they measured?
Three great questions there. I think I'll invite each of the panelists one by one to pick the question that they feel best placed to answer. Starting with Severity.
Thanks. And no, that's a good question that you had about how do you actually contextualize. And I would say that often you might not come into organizing a citizens' assembly or any other community process by talking about climate change, because people may not necessarily either know the term, or it would be by responding to the concern that they do have. I mean, it could be flooding, it could be extreme heat, it could be, homelessness, and mobility challenges or road safety. And then it is up to, then the designers also, the local government with whom you want to do the assembly. And I think what the Climate Assembly format also does is forces us to think very carefully about, what is the issue at stake? What are we going to discuss? If that is the agenda, then what is the learning that we're going to have? What is the deliberation going to be about? Who's coming? And you contextualize according to that. But it is really to be responsive to the needs of the community and really look at how this agenda setting is happening. But I think the Citizens Assembly format is flexible, and it is, of course, to make it make the most of the design principles that are there, and use it to contextualize and make those meaningful. And but a lot more thinking, creativity does need to go into making them much more effective.
I'm actually going to cede my time because I want to hear from these folks who have such great ideas. But I was just thinking the question about how to implement more deliberation at the, say, multilateral level. I just want to come back to the pecan model. I think there's a lot to learn here. That would be really exciting to explore. And that listening-based storytelling also, to inform. What is it to really embed that would be really interesting going forward. But I'm just going to leave it there. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Question about addressing the disparities in climate impacts, the effects of climate impacts. And I often have this, not this issue, but this problem whenever people talk about the Pacific. They talk about the Pacific as experiencing the climate crisis the same as a monolith. And I think, if you break that down, the Pacific makes up 1/3 of the world's surface. And we have low-lying atolls and mountainous nations like Fiji. So the way that we experience climate change and climate change impacts is vastly different. Now you add Asia to the mix, because often Asia-Pacific are grouped together in the multilateral spaces. And that adds a whole lot more complexity. So what I'm thinking is and I don't think the two questions are unrelated. One is about contextualizing, and I think the other one is about ownership of the process. So you talked about UN agencies and bringing them in, or moving away from them. As a person in the civil society space, I would steer clear. I would, welcome the support, but the funding, the funding, the design process, that all has to be locally owned, right? Because I think my experience being kind of the recipient of a lot of development aid is the flyby development aid that happens, where the project is really driven by the person leading it, but once that person leaves, it's like luck of the draw, who comes next? And then it depends on kind of how that's pushed. And so, it really is connecting those two pieces. It's connecting like the effort to contextualize it, and that contextualizing comes from the ownership of the process. Oh, sorry, and just one more on the comment about the pecan kind of approach. I think it's important to mention that pecan is also kind of the upward flow of information that we have is our connection to Climate Action Network International. So Climate Action Network International is probably the largest network of environmental organizations in the world, around 2,500 members from across the region, and is one of, across the world, and is one of the official, what's the word, Rufino? Constituencies of the UNFCCC. And so the upward flow that we have is, well, the way that it's structured is CAN International sits as the people that drive the global work, but all of their work is informed by regional nodes. So PCAN is a regional node, but we have country nodes. So PCAN's positions are informed by country nodes, and then we push it up to the international, CAN International body. And it's just about representation in that space. Yeah, it's ensuring it's about voice equity. Really, it's making sure that the voices of, and this is that thing about narrative as well, moving away from kind of the victimhood approach to the way that we're considered, because I think the Pacific has done a lot of work in sowing the narrative of that we are not drowning, we are fighting. So moving from victimhood to resilience, and now to accountability. And so that process needs to happen as well. And I think, I think I'm just going to leave it at there, and then, we'll take a question.
Nicole.
Yeah, thanks. Just 3 quick points. First is, I think I want to emphasize that the book or the report is not a sales pitch for citizens' assemblies. And that's part of the back and forths we've had with the publisher as well. Like, you will not get a sales pitch that this is what you need, Global South. It's actually, it has a very critical take on citizens' assemblies as well. That's why in my presentation, I found it necessary to actually say, we need a new story of deliberative democracy, not one that is imported from the global north, cascaded to the global south. It's like, no. We've had a very long history of deliberative democracy as well. And I share your view with the title, like, is this another checklist that we need to do, right? So I share that criticality. But with a question about what counts as a successful citizens' assembly, there's a lot of debate in our very small community of evaluators of climate assemblies, but typically there's 3 dimensions. Is it inclusive? And inclusiveness is usually operationalized based on the extent to which the random selection of participants reflects the broader society. In the same way you evaluate a survey, right? Is your survey valid because it represents the demographic characteristics of the society? Now, random selection, at least in my experience in the Philippines, is very political. If you tell people you're randomly selected to take part in this forum, automatically people will be like, is it really random? Who asked for that? Did the mayor have a look at the list of people? Because there's also financial compensation attached to it. That's what happens in disaster response as well, right? Not everyone can get relief goods. We'll do a random selection, but only among the communities that the mayor likes, right? So it's very political, right? And that's why we need to ground these processes of recruitment and selection based on what random selection means in some contexts. In some Muslim contexts, random selection sounds like lottery. I mean, in Canada, they call it civic lottery, right? So is that gambling, right? And am I just supposed to represent myself, not my household? So if we don't do sortition as a method of recruitment, is that still a climate assembly? I would say no. And that's not a problem, because you don't need to do a citizens' assembly. You can do other forums that have other forms of inclusion. And then the other, which kind of ties to the other question about global governance, is impact. Usually impact is measured based on policy impact, but some argue that that is such a narrow way of assessing the impact of climate assemblies. So for some civil society-led, tend to which they sharpen the demands of protesters, for example. It's the way it sharpens the demands of civil society groups. Which brings me to the question of global governance. Caveat, these are not my ideas. I'm amplifying the ideas of my colleagues who have been trying to put together the second global assembly on the climate and ecological crisis. And actually, they find a very good opening for the COP that will happen in Brazil, because that is being portrayed as the people's COP. And their dream actually is that if you have the UN that has member states, if you have Davos that represents businesses, why don't we have a global assembly that represents everyday people from around the world, right? Or another way of thinking about this is if you have the IPCC that produces a report based on expert evidence, and some would say, well, the IPCC reports, they're not that powerful. They don't really shift, how climate negotiations happen, but it doesn't mean it's useless, right? And it's the same for climate assemblies, like that global assembly. What a global assembly can do is not necessarily convince the climate negotiators or states to change their position, but it's there to give the moral voice. Like, this is what the people, everyday people from the world think, right? And hopefully that informs climate policy making. Again, not my ideas, but amplifying the ideas of colleagues who are in the field.
Thank you, Nicole. Now, I'm really conscious of time. I'm not sure if we have any questions from online that we should recognize. And if not, I feel confident that our panelists will be sticking around. So if you're in the room and you had a question and you didn't have time to ask it, please stick around, because they're not going anywhere. Stay here. We're going to be mingling, and we'd love to continue these conversations with you. I've certainly got lots more questions that I haven't had a chance to ask you. Would it be cheeky to challenge you, provoke each of you to give us a closing sentence, a closing remark on thinking about, reflecting on all this? How optimistic do you feel about how these deliberative practices like climate assemblies can help build more ambitious and citizen-owned climate agendas? Dylan, you've been nominated.
I think it's just to go back to the point that Professor Nicole talked about. These processes have already been happening and have happened and continue to happen. And I think in the Pacific, we've seen it shift narratives and shift positions. And so, it may be, we talked about the issue of sortition. While it may not fit into the category of climate assemblies, there are instances where I guess the spirit of what the climate assemblies kind of tries to achieve is already being kind of entrenched and taken up. That ownership is taken up by people, by civil society, by activists, and by people at large. So definitely optimistic, because a good example actually is the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion. So we have oral hearings that are starting in December, and while it is a state process, we are mobilizing on the outside and creating a people's hearing. And that's just to share the narratives of people on the front lines of the climate crisis that sometimes may differ from what they're saying inside, but it's really grounding that whole proceeding and ensuring that citizens...
You're making me think about how we might enact a recognition of how differently we're situated within this work. When you talk about being collectively owned, for all the benefits that come of that, including all the richness of the solutions are already here, just need people to take these up, commit to them, have political will, but also where the funding is, this idea that it's been so driven by who holds the purse, and often with a preconceived idea and timeline about what that looks like, and it just happens fast, speed is a weapon of the powerful and of the status quo, and that's such an interesting thing to think about with how would where the resources are, particularly with the academic weight around it, but also the funding bodies around it, and then also in the uptake. Those are really the challenges when we talk about the richness that's already on the ground, not just on the ground, but as you're describing, actually all the way through up to the international level. It's beautiful to think about that model. But so focusing attention on where that power is, on the advantages, the resource is, what would it look like to actually focus on the consequentiality, the uptake, all of our attention on using what we've got. We've got so many amazing insights already, like you said, ambitious, we have these. So what would it be to focus on uptake and the impact of those, and maybe less so than proliferating a particular model, but also the funding. So what would it be to really focus energy on adapting and transforming and getting, doing some internal work to think about what it looks like to support that differently so it can emerge, in its, not just emerge, it can be supported in its own terms where it is already happening. Yeah, that's what comes to mind.
Yeah. No, I agree also that India has a very, very strong civil society sector with very many good NGOs and community-based organizations doing rights-based work or implementation in, say, watershed or natural resources management, etc. And they've been doing really good work. And what I feel is that, when you attach the word climate assembly to it, it's very well worth looking at the climate assembly format, the design principles, and seeing that how do we use the strength of the sector of working with communities and people and attach the urgency, because you might have been doing work on some sector, but we want to now talk about climate, and there is an urgency attached to it, and certainly looking at the efficacy, looking at the funding, and I think a deliberation if, say, within India, I would really like to see deliberations about the format of public deliberations and attaching the climate urgency to all the civil society work and with the government and corporate social responsibility of philanthropy coming in, so that we can really advance citizens' work that much more to deal with the climate emergency. So I think I'm optimistic, but I see that there's a lot of creativity that needs to go into making it really work for us. Yeah.
So my dream is to have a global assembly on the climate and ecological crisis, where an everyday citizen from Nairobi is in conversation with an everyday citizen from, let's say, London. And the takeaway from that climate assembly is that the failure of deliberation is not actually happening in Nigeria. The failure of deliberation, they realize, is actually happening in London, where British citizens have to hold multinational corporations from that country and problematize that, right? And realize that the failure of deliberation is actually happening in the global north, right? And if we see these interconnected politics, I think citizens' assemblies that are global in nature can actually have that putting in London. And the solidarity of people in London should also go to people in Nairobi. So instead of pathologizing people from the global south, that we need your capacity to build your capacity to deliberate, we need to teach you how to deliberate, I think these climate assemblies can teach people from the global north that you also need to deliberate harder and convince your governments to do better. Only then will I be convinced of the power of climate assemblies.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Sanskriti Menon, Emily Beausoleil, Dylan Carver, Nicole Karatu, and I will hand over to Naila. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, our speakers. You're free to have your seat. Thank you so much to all our speakers for that very insightful discussion. To formally conclude our program, I am pleased to invite Kirsten Bishop, Acting First Assistant Secretary of the Development Effectiveness and Enabling Division at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Australia, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Naila, and thank you to International IDEA and the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance for inviting me to provide closing remarks today on behalf of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I also extend my thanks to each of today's presenters and panellists for such a fascinating and robust conversation. Before I begin, I just wanted to also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, and recognise any other people or families with connections to the land of the ACT and our region. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today or online. I also wish to acknowledge and welcome Excellencies, distinguished guests, members of the diplomatic community, including the special delegation from the Parliament of Bhutan, students, academics, and other colleagues joining us here today. So this past September at the Asia Summit, Foreign Minister Wong remarked that Australia has a deep focus on strengthening our relationships in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, shaping a region in which all voices are heard and countries can work together to address our shared challenges. One important way that we are continuing to strengthen these relationships across the Indo-Pacific region is through our development cooperation partnerships. And our approach to development cooperation is well aligned and with the principles and the practices of deliberative democracy and climate assemblies, some of which we've heard about this afternoon. Our approach emphasises working in genuine partnership through listening and backing locally led development priorities and action, with a focus on building effective, accountable, resilient states and communities, connecting our region, and generating collective action on global challenges.
So in this way, we recognise, as highlighted by the report and also by the discussion this afternoon, the importance of governance processes that are inclusive, that enable local voices to be heard, and that support different actors to chart a way forward in partnership in helping to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Australia's relationships and partners at the local and national levels across the region also inform and help strengthen our regional, multilateral and global engagement, including by supporting our regional neighbours to participate and engage in raising climate ambition, pushing for greater global action to keep the 1.5C goal within reach. And here I would really like to highlight the role of Pacific Voices in demonstrating sustained and innovative leadership to push global ambition in responding to climate change, as highlighted so clearly by Dylan this afternoon, and also helping us to understand how we can best support our neighbours in their transition towards net zero. So the imperative for accelerated climate action is clear, and given the region's complex constellation of risks from climate and geohazards, population growth, food and energy security, with associated implications for political and economic stability and security. And for this reason, Australia is committed to climate action and the energy transition in our region. And for example, at the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit in March, Australia announced $2 billion for a Southeast Asian investment financing facility to boost Australian private sector investment in the region's clean energy transition and infrastructure development. And also Australia's joint COP31 bid, which we're doing together with our Pacific neighbours, which seeks to galvanise climate action and increase attention to our region's unique challenges and resilience in the face of climate change. Our engagement with the region on climate action is the result of years of important conversations across the region, spanning differing opinions and expectations of Australia's role. But what is often common is an appreciation of diverse, locally grounded, open and respectful debate. Values and principles which require our ongoing commitment and must not be taken for granted. Citizen assemblies embody these democratic principles and, as we've heard, can create an accountability loop between leaders and citizens, can build trust, which is essential, as we know, for locally legitimate, sustainable approaches to address what are increasingly complex challenges. So the impacts of climate change and the solutions to the challenges that it presents, as we've heard so clearly this afternoon and through the report, transcend any single community or country approach, and as such require inclusive and collective deliberation to find meaningful paths forward. Deliberation that enables participation, particularly of marginalised voices across genders, geographies, cultures, abilities and experiences. And as the report launched here today highlights, and also the discussion amongst our panellists makes so clear, there are many innovative means by which citizens and communities in Australia's neighbouring regions and across the globe are already participating in climate policy action. Australia takes a holistic approach also to supporting deliberative processes of this kind, both at home and with our partners in the region. So, for example, the engagement by Australia's First Nations community and valuable First Nations knowledge to underpin our climate and environment policy action, and also our support for the fully Ni Vanuatu-led Vanuatu Skills Partnership, which is helping to develop the skills sector in Vanuatu, including by influencing government policies and strategies at national and provincial levels. And finally, I'd also like to note the Australia Tuvalu Whalapili Union, which came into force in August this year, which leveraged and empowered extensive local leadership, consultation and knowledge, and resulted in a new bilateral treaty for safeguarding Tuvalu's future in the face of climate change. In closing, I wish to recognise that 2024 marks the biggest election year in history. The people of 72 countries are voting this year. And this time next week, the US elections will be taking place. So the results of all of these elections across the globe will, of course, have ramifications on global climate action. So now, more than ever, the role of deliberative democracy is important to ensure climate ambition and to fast-track our transformation. So whether in major cities or remote islands, principles of inclusion, listening, locally led action and partnership are central to meaningfully addressing our collective climate challenges. Again, I extend my appreciation for the work and expertise being brought to bear on these critical challenges. As Dr. Kevin Casas-Zamora, the Secretary General of International IDEA himself has acknowledged, while climate assemblies are no silver bullet for climate policy, these inclusive democratic approaches, particularly if adapted to local context, building on existing knowledge systems and positioned as part of broader governance institutions and processes, can and already are providing vital momentum for effective climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bishop. So that concludes our program. Thank you once again for joining us, our guests who are here today and also online. So a recording of this event will be uploaded on the International IDEA website and YouTube channel. And to also mention and also remind everyone that we have printed hard copies of the publication, so feel free to get one from the registration table, or if you prefer, to download it from the website. So please join us for drinks and canapes, just also in the hallway. And thank you once again for joining us. Good day.